this short video, we're going to take a look at OCI Bastion. But what actually is OCI Bastion? This service provides restricted and time-limited access to VM instances that don't have a public IP address, typically via either SSH or remote desktop protocol. The main reason for this is to avoid making VM instances publicly accessible unnecessarily. So for example, in some instances, you may not have a VPN or Fast Connect configured to your OCI tenancy, which means the only way you can actually get access to resources is across the public internet. So often I'll work with customers and find they've got VM instances that are actually available directly across the internet for this very reason. Now you don't need to do that. You can actually put VM instances into a private subnet that aren't directly accessible over the internet and use a Bastion to actually get access to them. In addition to this, a Bastion service can also be useful as a fallback. Even if you do have a VPN or Fast Connect connection to your OCI tenancy, if this should fail for whatever reason, the Bastion service potentially gives you the opportunity to connect back into those VM instances should a failure occur. And we see time and time again, it's really not a good idea to make VM instances available directly over the internet. If you do a search, there's literally news article after news article that speaks about really nasty hacks because attackers have managed to get access to machines that have been available directly over the internet, either via SSH or RDP. Now, the way that the Bastion service works, in the specific example I will use today, we will have a web server that runs Windows Server, that we provision a Bastion within each virtual cloud network that we have within OCI. Once the Bastion has been created, we can then create something called a Bastion session, which is time limited to a maximum of 3 hours. And this enables an end user to create an SSH tunnel between their machine and the Bastion service. And from this point onwards, they can then connect to a VM instance that sits behind the Bastion, either directly using SSH or using port forwarding, for example, to connect to a Windows server over port 3389. And unlike some other hyperscalers, the Bastion service in OCI is absolutely free of charge. So what we'll do now is step through the process of provisioning the Bastion service, creating a session so that we can get access to a Windows Server instance that sits within a private subnet. Okay, so we are now within my OCI tenancy. And if we just take a quick look at the compute instances that I've got, you'll see I've got Windows Server here. It doesn't have a public IP. It's only available via a private IP address. So what we'll do is use the Bastion service to get a connection to this server using remote desktop protocol. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to actually provision the Bastion service. And as I touched upon earlier, the Bastion service needs to be provisioned within each VCN that you require access to. So if we select Bastion from here, I'm in my demo compartment and you can see we don't have a Bastion there. So I'm just going to select this to create Bastion. I will give it an imaginative name of Bastion. I will put it into the demo VCN network, and I will also put it into the private subnet. You can also configure a allow list, which basically is a list of IP addresses that are allowed to connect from across the internet to the Bastion service. Now, what I'm going to do is something that's very insecure, so I wouldn't do this, is basically allow any machine on the internet to connect to the Bastion service. What you would do in the real world is put in the IP address ranges that your machine is accessing the internet via, just to keep things a little bit secure and to minimize the potential risk. The final option that we've got is to configure the maximum session time to live. So once we've created the Bastion service, to actually get access to a server, we create a session within the service. And by default, the maximum time limit is 3 hours for a session. After that time, the session gets torn down and you lose access to the machine. So if I just select Create Bastion here, that should now go away and provision an instance of the Bastion service. I'll just keep hitting refresh here until it comes to life. Right, the Bastion service has now been successfully provisioned. So now the service is in place, we can create a session. So if we go to the Session tab and select Create Session, because we are going to connect to a Windows server, what we need to do is change the session type from Managed SSH Session to SSH Port Forwarding Session. So rather than connecting end-to-end over port 22, we'll do an SSH connection to the Bastion. The Bastion will then forward traffic to the RDP port for Windows, which is port 3389. We'll keep the session name as default. We'll choose the instance name that we need to connect to. So we've got the demo instance compartment selected there. We'll select Windows, which is the name of the instance that run Windows, and the port that we will be connecting to is the RDP port, so that's 3389. We then need to configure the SSH keys that we will use to authenticate to the Bastion service, because you've got to remember there are two steps for authentication when using Bastion. The initial connection to the Bastion service itself, and then subsequent authentication requests from the Bastion to the backend VM instance resources. In the case of Windows, we will do in SSH to the Bastion service, and then just using the RDP username and password to connect to the server itself. Now what I will do here is create a new pair of SSH keys for this. So if I select that button and then select Save Private Key and then Save Public Key, they'll be saved locally to my machine. If I then hit Create Session, it should go off and create the Bastion session for us. It'll take a little while to create this session, and once it's been created, it will actually give us a command that we can use to create the initial SSH session to the Bastion service. So if I just give this a quick refresh, we can see that the session is now active. Now, if we hit these three little dots here, it will give us the SSH command that we need to run to get access to the Bastion. So I will take a copy of this, and what we'll then do is, from a terminal, do the initial SSH connection. Okay, so now what I'll do is I will go to the terminal. So a key prerequisite for using the Bastion service is to ensure that you have an SSH client on your machine, because the connection to the Bastion, regardless of how it connects to the resources behind, will always use SSH. I'm using a Mac, so SSH is available there. Now what I need to do is paste the command in that was provided. So if we remember, we go here, copy the command, and we can then paste this into the terminal window. Now there are a few pieces of information that is required. The first piece of information that we need to provide is the name of the SSH private key that was generated when we created the Bastion. So what we will do here is put in that. Mine's just called literally SSH key. The next thing that we need to update is a local port. So this is a local port on the machine that will get redirected to the end port. In this specific case, we are redirecting to RDP on the Windows server that sat behind the Bastion, which listens on port 3389. To keep things simple and to avoid any port conflicts on my local machine, I am going to redirect port 3390 on my machine to port 3389 on the Windows VM instance, which has the IP address of 10.0.1.43. So just as a quick reminder, the two key pieces of information to update are: one, provide the name of the private key that was generated, and secondly, provide the local port for this to listen on. Now, once we've done that, we should just be able to hit return. And then we get this, which warns us that our SSH key is to open. Now on Mac, the way to fix this is chmod 600, and then if we do ssh.key, that should update the permissions. And now if we run the command, it should hopefully be successful. Now the one thing that is a little bit strange is all we see here is a flashing cursor, which looks like it's maybe doing something or processing something in the background. It's not. This means it's successful. We have the connection now between our local machine and the Bastion using SSH. So the next step is to actually make a connection to the server that sits behind the Bastion. And the way that we will do this, from my Mac, I'm going to use the Windows desktop app to connect to my server. So the server is called Web Server 1. However, I've updated the connection details so that rather than connect to a specific IP address, it's connecting to the local machine, but the port that we will be redirecting. So in this case, I'm connecting to port 3390 on my local machine. What should then happen is the SSH tunnel that we have up and running will redirect this traffic down the tunnel, across to the Bastion, and then back to the Windows server that we have within our private subnet within the virtual cloud network. So if I double click this now, what should hopefully happen is we should then get a connection to this machine after a few seconds. So here we go, we're in. This is actually the first time I've ever connected to this machine, so it'll ask me to reset my password, but that's just to quickly show you how to create a Bastion and then how to create a Bastion session to a Windows server using RDP. Hopefully you found this useful. Thanks a lot for watching.